Welcome all. In this video I will demonstrate the for loop, and before we do that we first will continue with the while loop, and I will give an example how we can execute a particular set of statements for a certain amount of times. So for example, we have a set of statements and we want to execute these for 10 times. So let's see how we do that. So first we make a variable I and we assign the value 0 to this variable. Then we create a while loop, and as a condition I check whether I is smaller than 10. So I use the number 10 here because we want to execute the set of statements for 10 times. But for example, if you wanted to execute these statements for 20 times, you have to use the number 20 here. Yeah, but for now we want to execute these for 10, so we type the number 10 here. So then here we type the statements which we want to execute for 10 times, which is in this case cout I and L. So I want to print the value in I. And I also want to print some text, which is do something. And finally, we have to increase the value in the variable I by 1. And how we do that is by typing the statement I is I plus 1. Yeah, so what happens here is that I take the current value in I, then increase it by 1, and the result is being copied into I. So therefore I is being overwritten. Another way to do that is by typing I plus plus, and this is also a short syntax that we can use to increment the value in I by 1. Yeah, so you can use either I is I plus 1 to increase the value in I by 1, or use the statement I plus plus. So let's run this program. So what you see here, it prints do something for 10 times, and in between it prints the value in I from 0 to 9. So what happens here is the following. So we start on line 11, we create a variable I and assign the value 0 to this variable. Then on line 13 we check whether I is smaller than 10, and since I is 0 at the beginning, we check if 0 is smaller than 10. That's true, so it enters the while loop. Then it executes the statements on line 15 and 16. So here on line 15 it prints 0 because the value in I is 0, which we see here on the console. And furthermore on line 16 it prints do something, which we see here. Then on line 18 we increase the value in I by 1. So the current value in I is 0. So 0 plus 1 is 1. And 1 is then being copied into I. So I becomes 1. Then it jumps back to the top of the while loop. And now I is 1. 1 is still smaller than 10. And so therefore it will enter the while loop again. Then on line 15 it prints the value in I, which is 1, and therefore we see a 1 here. Then on line 16 it prints do something, that's what we see here. And on line 18 we increase the value in I again by 1. So now the current value of I is 1, so 1 plus 1 is 2, so therefore 2 is being copied into I, and I therefore becomes 2. Yeah, and so this pattern repeats 10 times. And what you see here is that we need several lines to accomplish this, to execute some set of statements for a certain amount of times. Namely, we first here have to make a variable I. Then we need here one line for the while loop, and we also need to increase the value in I by 1 every iteration. So to do this more compact, we can use a for loop. Yeah, so we will create the same program as we did here, but now with a for loop, and we will see that it's more compact. So to create a for loop, we have to type for, then rounded brackets, and then curly brackets. And between the rounded brackets, we make 3 sections, and each section is being separated by a semicolon. And in the first section, we initialize a variable. I will explain what this means in a minute. Then we place here a condition. And the third section will be a particular statement. So with initializing a variable, what we mean by that is by creating a variable and also assign a value to this variable. So for example, we create a variable I and we assign the value 0 to this variable. Yeah, so this is what we mean by initializing a variable. For the condition, we make the condition I is smaller than 10. So we check if the value in I is smaller than 10. And the statement we use here is I plus 1. Yeah, so with this statement we increase the value in I by 1. Then in the for loop, so meaning between the curly brackets here, we can define statements. So the statements I type here are these. So first I print the value in I, and then I print the text do something with an exclamation mark. And this piece of code does exactly the same as what is written here. So I will explain the for loop quickly. So when we reach the for loop, what happens first is it executes this part of the for loop, so this section. So it will initialize a variable and assign a value to this variable. So in this case, we create a variable named I and assign the value 0 to this variable. Then this condition is being checked. So whether I is smaller than 10. And if this is true, then the statements in the for loop are being executed. So meaning the statements between the curly brackets here. So when the statements here are being executed, then the statement in the third section here is being executed finally. And then it jumps back to the condition here again, which is being checked again. And if the condition is still true, then the statements here in the for loop will be executed again. And then finally this statement will be executed again. Yeah, so in this case we have the variable I, which is assigned to the value 0. 0 is smaller than 10, so therefore it will jump into the for loop, meaning executing the statements in the for loop. And after executing these statements, the statement I plus 1 is being executed, meaning I is increased by 1. And therefore, after executing this statement, I becomes 1. Then it checks this condition again. 1 is smaller than 10, and therefore it will enter the for loop again, executing these statements again, and finally executes this statement. So increasing I by 1, therefore I becomes 2, and this pattern repeats until this condition becomes false. And when this condition becomes false, then the program continues under the for loop. Yeah, so that's exactly the same pattern we have seen here. So what we did here first is initializing a variable, which we also do here in the for loop, firstly. Then we check the condition here of the while loop, which we also did here in the for loop. That's this condition here. Then we execute the statements here, which we also did here in the for loop, because those are these statements here. And at the end of the while loop, we increased I by 1, which we also did here in the for loop. Yeah, and when we increased I by 1, then we jumped back here at the top of the while loop and checked the condition here again, which we also did here in the for loop. Yeah, so the piece of code here performs exactly the same as what we did here, but now here the for loop is more compact. So let's run this program. And what you see here, it executes twice the same code. So we see here 0 to 9 with the text do something printed in between, and that's also what we see happen from here on. So it starts here by printing 0 until 9 with the text do something in between. So that's it for this video. In this video we have seen how to use a for loop.